Good afternoon. I'm George Latimer, Westchester County Executive, and I'm joined here by two of our senior managers in the Westchester County Administration who've been involved in a report on Playland, as well as joined by Deputy County Executive Ken Jenkins, Director of Operations Joan Mcdonald, and County Attorney John Nona. We're here also with our Chief of Staff, Andrew Ferris, and some other members of our administration, and Majority Leader of the Board of Legislators, Catherine Parker, is here. Any of us will be available for one-on-one interviews when we're finished with our presentation, and then we'll take questions as a group and then individually if you'd like. This visit today is about transparency. We have promised over the course of my campaign last year, the transition period, and now my administration, that we would operate in an open fashion, and we would share with the Board of Legislators, with the press, and with the people of Westchester County important issues as we dealt with them. And as much as we're happy to come whenever we have a good, happy announcement, we're also here to lay out specifics on issues when the outcome may not be assured, and also the dialogue is not necessarily a happy dialogue. Today we are, though, here to talk about an analysis that has been done by the new administration and two of our senior managers on the Playland arrangements that were made with Standard Amusement by the prior administration, and to indicate that we have some very great concerns about those arrangements, and that we believe it opens the door for, at the very least, further dialogue about whether the relationship should continue in the fashion that was agreed upon. The most important issue to be dealt with here is what are the best interests of Westchester's taxpayers and what are the best interests of Westchester's residents. That is more important than any other issue that's involved with all of these things. In principle, we often talk about public-private partnerships as being an unalloyed good thing. Whenever we can get from the private sector an investment that offsets a public investment of money with the presumption that that will save us tax dollars, that is almost always intrinsically a good thing. I've spent 20 years in corporate America. I've negotiated any number of different arrangements during my professional years and, of course, during my public years. And each deal has to stand on its own merits. Once you get past the philosophy, it comes down to the devil being in the details. And in each of these different situations, there can sometimes be an expectation that obligations that we have in the public sector will be picked up by the private sector because those of us in the public sector don't want to pay for them anymore. We don't feel that they're an efficient use of our money. But from a private sector standpoint, there isn't any private interest that doesn't operate on the basis of trying to make a profit. That is perfectly appropriate in the society that we live in. So the question isn't, is the private entity operating in their interest? They certainly are, and they're entitled to do that. The question is, are we operating, when we're the decision makers in the public domain, in the public interest? And that push and pull between those two interests, in theory, is what would give you the best possible arrangement where you determine that a public-private partnership is warranted. It is not warranted in all cases, and certainly in some cases it's very much warranted. So I don't approach this, our administration does not approach the challenge of working with businesses, or for that matter, not-for-profits, which fall into the same category, on the basis that there's an automatic good thing or there's an automatic bad thing about these things. We have to look at each of them individually and make those decisions rationally. What I've tasked Joan Mcdonald and John Nona to do in the very first week of this administration was to take a look at a number of different entities, and in this particular case, the arrangements made between Westchester County and Standard Amusements relative to the governance and operation of Playland. Playland was created in 1928 by generations before us, great-grandparent generations of decision makers in Westchester County. For many years, it was the jewel of the Westchester County park system. For many years, it generated sufficient money to be able to fund the totality of the park system in Westchester County. All of the parks and facilities that we've come to know were financed through the profitability of Playland. Things change in the society, and over the past number of years, different administrations have tried different strategies to repurpose or restructure the governance and the operation of Playland. In the early 1980s, County Executive Al Del Bello went into a contractual relationship with what was then the amusement park division of Marriott Corporation. It doesn't exist anymore, but at the time it did. And for 2 years, Marriott came in and ran Playland Amusement Park. It has been operated as a part of the Parks Department. It has been operated as part of a separate commission-governed entity. We've gone through a variety of different proposals. My predecessor had a proposal with a group called Sustainable Playland that was signed and then ultimately discontinued when that was not seen to be ultimately a workable strategy. So we are operating in the same fashion as has been operated before by prior administrations, looking at Playland as the asset that it is and determining what is the best way to structure the use of that asset and the best way for us to go forward. The analysis that was done by John and Joan draw off of their professional experience. Now, we've introduced them long ago as members of the administration, but it's worth repeating. John Nona has an estimable career in the private sector as a lawyer. He's worked for major New York law firms as a partner. Most recently, he was with, I have to make sure I get the sequence of these together, Squire Patton Boggs in Manhattan. Previously, he was a partner in Dewey & LaBeouf before there was a reorganization of that law firm. He has public policy experience as a former county legislator, former mayor of Pleasantville, but his career has been established as a lawyer who's been involved in complicated negotiations and complicated litigation in the private sector. That is what he brings to the table as county attorney. Joan Mcdonald, who's with us as our Director of Operations, has, in 2 separate occasions in 2 separate states, been the commissioner of a statewide department. In New York State, the Commissioner of Transportation. In the state of Connecticut, the Commissioner of Economic Development. In addition to that, she worked within the hierarchy of Metro North, commuter rail. She's been in the New York City economic development area. She has served as a staffer in the state legislature going back any number of years. So from an operational standpoint and from a law standpoint, John and Joan both bring very specific expertise to the table. And that is important to understand. We approach these things without an ideological tilt, but with a very studied, pragmatic approach. Now, my personal situation as I looked at this during the course of last year's campaign, I was critical of what the plan was because I did not think it was presented with sufficient transparency. So what we are doing today in sharing this report with the press, by extension to the public, we have already shared with the Board of Legislators. They've had an opportunity to receive the report, and over the course of the next month, 2 months, whatever length of time is the preference of the Board of Legislators, they will have the opportunity to discuss what's in these reports, bring in anybody they want to testify and discuss, so that as partners, the 2 branches of government, we will make decisions about how to go forward. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but we will have a discussion with Standard Amusements and determine where that discussion goes, whether it leads to negotiations or any other kind of actions. I do not view in any of this Standard Amusements in a negative light. I have spoken with Nick Singer and his principals. I think they're fine men and women, and they intend, as part of their vision, to do what they think is best. The question is whether or not the deal that we have on the table is the right thing to do, and what flaws exist in the arrangements that were made, and whether or not we're in a position to change them. This basically reopens the dialogue on the future of Playland in light of the contract with the Westchester County and Standard Amusement. How that process of reopening the dialogue determines is yet to be seen, but we will play that out. Let me highlight that Playland will open next week, May 12th, for the 2018 season. It will open unimpeded by any of these discussions. It was always planned that Westchester County would be operating Playland in the 2018 season. That is exactly what's going to happen. Kathy O'Connor and her team are prepared to do the things that are necessary to provide an excellent year at Playland. And there are certain capital projects and things that are happening because they were meant to happen regardless of whatever our arrangements are. But I highlight that because in the discussion over the governance issue and the arrangements of the public-private partnership, there should be no misunderstanding that Playland will open on time, will operate this year as it has in the past. Hopefully we'll see improvements down there in the operation year of 2018 as we go forward. Members of the press, I believe, have received a synopsis provided by Catherine Chaffee, our excellent Director of Communications, that synopsizes the more detailed report, and you have the more detailed report in your possession. My purpose here is to go through the synopsize at a condensed fashion, allow Joan and John to make a few comments on their own, then open it up to questions, and then we'll try to give you a next step result on this. The analysis that Joan and John have provided us, and through their conversations, has pointed out some very serious concerns in the contract as it was agreed upon by the prior administration and approved by the Board of Legislators. The first most serious element of this is there have been extensions and changes to the contract arrangements that were made without the approval of the Board of Legislators. Some of them may be more ministerial. The most recent one, the fifth of these different changes, flips the sequence of events of what the obligations of Standard Amusement is vis-a-vis the obligations of the county, putting the county first in terms of having to lay out money prior to Standard Amusements being responsible to do that. And that is a significant material change in the original arrangements as was approved by the Board of Legislators. Anytime a major change is made to a contract that's been approved to the Board of Legislators has the right and the responsibility to be briefed on those changes before they are signed and agreed to. If they are a party to the original agreement, they must be party to any significant change in the agreement. That was not done in the case of the most recent set of changes. And these changes occurred between early November and January 1st. And that was the transition period when the old administration knew that they would be ending at the end of the year and a new administration would follow in January. We've identified through this report that there was not a detailed assessment of the renovations that were needed to be done at Playland. The estimates that we believe are accurate now puts the need for capital in the vicinity of $125 million worth of renovations. That's a significant number. And if we're looking at what this may mean to the county, estimates, and they range depending on how you interpret the language, but this could mean something like $65 to $95 million of county obligation in order to complete those renovations. We did a walkthrough about 4 weeks ago, 3-4 weeks ago at Playland, and candidly, the park shows the wear and tear from having insignificant amounts of capital put into it over the last 8 years. That is a fact. I live right near Playland. I see Playland every single day of my life. However, to walk down and to look at the lack of investment that has gone on over time is to understand that we are in a hole of our own making because we did not make prudent investments all along the lines. And now we plausibly believe that it will take $125 million of improvements to get us to the place where we need to be. There are very specific elements that were highlighted in this report. For example, county employees, there's 30 of them that work at Playland and the Playland Beach and Pool, and the agreement with Standard Amusements covers 100% of their salaries, but only 30% of their fringe benefits. The fringe benefits, because they're low-salaried individuals, is more like 75% of their salary base, because fringe benefits are relatively fixed based on the employee, and the amount that they're paid can differ. But we're talking about a significant percentage of dollars which will fall to the county to pay, which should have been picked up as part of this original arrangement. The agreement only covers the county's expense of $400,000 for county police and seasonal park rangers. We estimate the cost of these services is $655,000. So we have baked into the cake with this arrangement a shortfall of $255,000, and that's an annual expense. That's an annual expense of $255,000 that should have been identified and dealt with. The county receives no profit sharing until roughly 11 years after Standard Amusements takes over management of the park. 11 years. And even that is not exactly clear. That is a long period of time to expect to go until the county receives any profit sharing, given the fact that the county will have to lay out significant capital. The revenue and attendance growth assumptions in this agreement may well be considered as overstated. We approximately had 500,000 visitors to the park last year. In other years, we've had numbers higher than that. But this arrangement assumes that we will get to 1 million people in attendance by 2020. That's a significant increase in a fairly short period of time. To this point, Standard Amusement has paid only $1 million to the county of initial payments that it was required to make, and our understanding is it owes $1.25 million. Standard Amusements has stated that it has spent about $4 million of the $27.5 million that they're required to spend. There's a request by the county for an audit of expenses to date, and we need to see that document in order to know what exactly that $4 million has been spent on, given the fact that the county is still operating the park and the county is still obligated for certain capital improvements to open the door. In the arrangement between the county and Standard Amusements, an individual, Jacob, known as Jack Falfus, was identified by name as a key person to professionally manage Playland. He has left Standard Amusement, and since he is specifically identified as a point person in the arrangement, we have not seen who it is that's going to replace him, and that person's credentials are sufficient to be able to have this responsibility. I made a statement early today in a different context in which I said, as Chief Executive Officer of this county, I am probably unqualified to do at least 85% of the jobs that are employed in this county. You need specialized law enforcement experience to be in the Department of Public Safety, of which I do not have any of that, except maybe the Public Information Officer position. The same would be true in corrections. The same would be true in probation, public health, labs and research, all of those areas. In none of those areas do I have specialty experience. To run an amusement park properly takes special experience. It takes experience in the running of an amusement park, and that was an essential element of what this was. The extension issue that we've discussed is important. There's some details here. I'm going to let some of the numbers come through Joan and John's presentation so you understand what the exact implications are, but they involve whether or not Standard Amusement has an obligation to invest $3 million in new rides, when that obligation is triggered. And if you change the sequence of obligations, then you ensure that the county must put out significant money before we see the investment from Standard Amusements. There's capital investments that are involved in a host of different areas. There's a host of these specific things that I would rather let Joan and John discuss. We've talked about some of these different issues, the revenue sharing, the professional management, the expenses. Basically, on these specifics, which Joan and John are going to address in a second, we have to look at whether or not the concept of privatizing Playland is about what will better manage the asset, or what is, in essence, a step to devolve the asset out of county ownership. I think it's fair to say that there are individuals, certainly in the last administration, without identifying them individually, who have said publicly they didn't believe that we should run an amusement park, we should have an amusement park. And I think the lack of commitment to looking at Playland as an asset is what undermines this overall arrangements. You will negotiate the deal very differently if you see this facility as I do, which is this is the jewel of our park system. This is something unique. When someone says no other government owns or runs an amusement park, I don't consider that a negative. I consider that a positive. This was the wisdom and the vision generations ago to take this piece of land and turn it into something very special. And when I close off, I'll address that issue. So how you approach the value of this asset will determine how you negotiate the arrangements to manage it. And I'm afraid that my general sense of it is that this was viewed as some type of a loss leader, which it is not, and therefore was subject to devolution to a private entity, rather than to find that right balance between public and private interests in the negotiation of this. With that, I'm going to ask Joan Mcdonald, and then followed by John Nona, to outline some of the things that they've said in this report, and then we'll come back and take questions. Joan.
Thank you. I just want to elaborate on a few of the points that the county executive made. First and foremost, the capital investments. When we started in this administration and were trying to wrap our arms around what was in the agreement between the county and Standard, one of the first questions I asked with my background in capital planning at Metro North Railroad was, what's our capital plan, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And we did not have a detailed plan. So I directed the staff at DPW and Parks to undertake that, which is where the $125 million came from. The agreement stated that the county is responsible for $33 million in capital investments, plus whatever is necessary for the pool, and Standard is responsible for $27 million, of which $14 million is in ride investment. The agreement also states that Standard does not have to make any investment until the county makes 50% of their capital investments. So, from having been involved in some of these public-private partnerships in my prior positions, when the private entity doesn't have skin in the game at the beginning, that's not a great thing. So that was how we came to take a look at the capital. And as the county executive said, there was a period of disinvestment. It's the jewel of the county. I will stress, as he did, which is it is safe. There are no safety issues at the park, but there are some investments that need to be made, and the park will open next week. I want to elaborate a little bit on the revenue sharing. The county receives a basic flat fee of $300,000, and that is entitled to a percentage of the revenue from the 11th year going forward. But the way the revenue is assessed, it's on a net revenue basis. So on a net revenue basis, you can put a lot of expenses and your net can be zero. And that's not a good way to structure an agreement for the county as well. And then just lastly, we believe that the estimates for the park attendance are overestimated. It's been in the 400 to 520,000 over the last 4 or 5 years. To jump by 50% within the first 3 years, we think is very unrealistic, which gave an unrealistic expectation of what that revenue would be even before you got into the expense category. So we feel for those reasons and for, as the county executive said, that it's important for the taxpayers and the residents of this county to have a fair deal, which is what a private CEO would do also. He would want to make sure that it was a good deal for his shareholders, and the county executive is making sure it's a good deal for his shareholders, the taxpayers. John?
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, County Executive. I'm not going to discuss legal issues in detail and legal advice, but I will say that the legal issues are really driven by 3 overall issues. One, is Standard Amusements capable of meeting its obligations under this agreement, and has it met those obligations? And we mentioned the absence of a key person, Mr. Falfus, who was supposed to, who was identified in the agreement as a material person that would run the park. Secondly, if the likely financial impact this is a 30-year term, a long-term agreement, if the likely financial impact is not beneficial to the taxpayers, can we renegotiate it to make it more equitable and fair? Can we renegotiate the terms? Can we look at the fact that while there seems to be a thought that this was going to be an even split, that Standard Amusements was going to invest the same amount as the county, in fact, there's a provision in that agreement which opens the door for the county to be obligated to spend a lot more, and it's very unclear what that obligation is, and that needs to be revisited. And then finally, if we can't renegotiate what's the cost of terminating the agreement? Is it cheaper for the taxpayers to terminate the agreement than to go forward for a 30-year agreement that will be less advantageous, where the county will lose money, comparatively speaking? What's best for the taxpayers is our responsibility, and that's the way we have to look at the legal issues, not what's best for Standard Amusements. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Let me highlight one other element. We are talking about a park that serves residents in this community. And the residents and the taxpayers may actually be 2 slightly separate divisions within this county. But there are people who live in this county for whom Playland is an important recreational facility. And no government creates recreation on the belief that it's going to be profitable. They create it as a service for quality of life. Our pools that we have, whether Wilson Woods, Tibbetts, the Playland Pool, or Saxon Woods, they aren't created as a profit-making entity. We didn't create the various parks where you can hike and bicycle in order to create a profit, and we didn't do the same thing for our various nature centers, Lenoir Preserve or the Marshlands, Reed Sanctuary, Cranberry Lake, and these other ones. And I think it's very important to understand that whatever the usage of Playland is, there are parts of this county, people for whom getting on that bus or getting on that train and getting off and going to Playland is a very wonderful part of their experience living in this county. And it needs to be mentioned, and it needs to be part of the public policy discussion. There are also young people that find employment at Playland, and that becomes an important part of youth employment, which we talk about during the summer, keeping kids gainfully employed so that they're productive in the society and not necessarily destructive in the society. There are many other aspects that are not economic that go into the discussion of whether Playland makes sense or not. I've often talked about my youth and my youth in an urban part of this county and a poor urban part of this county. I remember very well getting on a bus to go to Playland, a couple of times each summer, going from one of the more urban, packed portions of this county to this wonderful facility that was owned by the county and was affordable out on the water. And it was a wonderful thing. And for kids to this day to go to Playland and to enjoy, whether it's Kiddieland or any of the other rides, the various entertainment that comes down on the bandstand and the festivals and the other activities that we have, this is very important. This is part of what makes Westchester, Westchester. And I think that we have failed to take their public interest into account when we make these discussions and these negotiations. I might add that I happen to live right across the street from it as a property owner. I'm a neighbor. And sometimes the neighbors of the property complain. It's noisy, there's a spillover crowd. It's no fun driving through my neighborhood on the 4th of July or on certain busy weekends and so forth. But I must tell you that if we reach the point in this county where we say if Playland isn't in my neighborhood of the county, then it doesn't matter to me, then that same principle can apply to Glen Island. If you don't live near Glen Island, then why have Glen Island? If you don't live near Ward Pound Ridge, why have Ward Pound Ridge? And then you can philosophically go through every one of the parks and every one of the services that we provide and say, if I don't use it, what good is it? I don't ride the county buses. We don't need a county bus because I don't use it. This is the devolution of public interest that comes out of an ideology. I ran against that ideology. In fact, I've run against that ideology in every one of my campaigns for public office because I believe that government has a responsibility to provide certain services that are broadly used in the society and in some cases which are unaffordable for some of the people in the society. If we were all wealthy, we'd all have pools in our backyard. But since we aren't, there is a reason for Wilson Woods and for Tibbetts and for Saxon Woods and for the Playland Pool. And the constant green eye shade mentality that recreation falls into the category of dollars and cents here and dollars and cents there. This park does not lose money. You can reallocate capital costs in a way for this park differently than any other park and determine that it somehow loses money. But if you apply the same principle to the kiddie playground in your neighborhood, that kiddie playground costs you money because you don't pay a fee to bring your kids into the playground. And I'm afraid that we've lost our way in the public policy discussion of Playland. We have to go back to what the original discussion was of why there is a Playland, why it exists to this day. We must be prudent. We must look for an intelligent way to use this asset in a way that is positive and is cost productive for us as a society. But it has an intrinsic purpose. It is not merely something we open in order to make a profit. And I want to make sure that the people of Westchester understand that in this administration, that is part of the discussion of the future of Playland. With that, we'll take any of your questions. I'll defer to my colleagues on more specific matters. Happy to talk in general. Peter.
As someone who has had a background in the private sector where you've looked at contracts, and the public sector, you've looked at contracts here and up in Albany, when you saw this from the inside, what was your reaction, and where would you rank this on a scale of, say, 1 to 10?
Well, if 10 is the best possible contract that you could have, I rank this, in the lower portion of it, 3 or 4. I viewed this, frankly, as I read it, and I didn't necessarily read it with the legal eye that John would put to it. But as a layman, I read the contract, and it felt to me as if this was an effort to rid ourselves of something rather than to have a long-term relationship that would improve the facility. And I read that because I saw very little return back to the people of Westchester County from this, and more an effort to try to put this asset in a private pair of hands. Now, I don't begrudge the private sector. Let me repeat what I said earlier. I have no animosity towards Standard Amusements. They negotiate based on what's in their best interest, and I have no problem that they were able to negotiate things a certain way. I have a problem with the end result of that negotiation. But I didn't feel that the negotiation, the product of the negotiation, was done in a way that really understood why Playland is important, why it needs to be in the public domain and protected and advanced for the future. And if I can answer one other element that you didn't ask, I come out of a background in marketing in the hospitality industry, and in that situation, we never stop thinking of creative ways to promote and push an asset that we have. My sense is, not because of the professionals who work in the department, but because of the policy that was set at the top of the government, that there was no effort to say, let us do everything we can do to market this facility and really bring attendance in and build for the future. If there's a change in buying habits, which there are many alternatives for recreation now than existed when I was a kid, but let us reflect how we want to change that strategy. I didn't see that investment made, and I don't think it was because of the professionals in the departments. I think it was a philosophy at the top of the pyramid. Other question, Lisa?
Are you going to go back to the table and renegotiate this contract or cancel this?
Well, I think the intent now will be to have a meeting with Standard Amusements. I'm sure we have shared with them this report. There's been an initial dialogue between their principal and their council and our key leaders. I suspect we'll be scheduling a meeting. It can happen as soon as is practical to review the agreements and discussion, and then we'll determine what kind of a dialogue comes out of that, Lisa. Simultaneously, this has been sent to the Board of Legislators. So the Board of Legislators is in a position to review the same information that we've received and have a discussion about how they view this. Keep in mind there are many new members of the Board of Legislators today than were there at the time that the contract was originally agreed to. There's a different configuration of individuals, and I want to make sure that all of those new members have a chance to look at these public policy issues. We have a contract in place, and I think John Nona said whether or not we renegotiate the contract, whether we terminate the contract, were we to feel that we needed to accept the contract as is, those are the options that are before us. Those are options that the Board of Legislators and the executive branch will work together toward. And now, through you, the people of Westchester will have a say as well. Okay, Peter, go ahead.
A question for John. You seem to be saying that in at least a couple of respects, Standard is in default. Is that a correct characterization?
That's the case certainly with respect to Mr. Balfus. We haven't formally put them in default, but he is not there anymore, and that's a material term of the contract. I think we're also entitled to know what they've spent their $4 million on to determine whether it was spent and provided some value to the county and to Playland. So those are two issues right off the bat where there's a question of whether they're in compliance with the contract.
And did you have any sense as to whether they're amenable to talking or do they seem to want to play hardball?
Well, my sense of my very preliminary discussions with their counsel, whom I know very well, is that they would like to sit down and talk.
And I heard directly from Nick Singer at Standard, and they are very interested in sitting down and continuing the dialogue.
Can I ask what changed with the capital assessment that inflated the estimate so largely? Has there been a change in staff or what?
No, I just think it wasn't done to the level of detail that should be expected in capital planning. Like I said, I come from a background of looking at 20 years out, and then 5 years you get more refined estimates, and it just wasn't done. And it needed to be done because that should have been the starting point for any discussion on investments into the park.
Mark, let me add to that as well. When I had the chance to do the tour a couple of weeks ago, I was with some of the staff within the Parks Department. And as we casually talked about what represented the capital needs of the park, they pointed to different items, and they, generally conversationally talked in terms of some significant numbers. As we talked through those numbers were very similar to the numbers that Joan has presented. And I think we have to be straightforward about this. You know how governments work. You have an executive level of elected and appointed leadership, and they set the policy. And people who work within that government provide professional information, but whatever that they do, that stays within the context of the government, and it comes back to the public and the press through the voice of the elected and appointed top leaders. So it may very well be that there was a more accurate estimation of these problems at the staff level. There's no way for any of us to know that. But in my interaction with the staff, I think they've been very clear about what capital is needed, and I think it matches up with the numbers that Joan has. So I think probably more likely it was a de-emphasis at the policy level of the administration that determined that, well, you might indicate we need that, but perhaps we don't really need that. We need this, and then the number comes out to be a different number. But let me tell you this much. You're welcome to walk down there yourself and look and see what you see. And you will see a wonderful asset. It's in condition to open for the year. It'll be safe. It'll be fun. But you see the need. You'll see the need. You'll see things that must be improved if they intend to continue in the years to come in the future. So I think the estimate that Joan has made is much closer to any reality, any objective estimate that anybody else might make. But you're welcome to walk through Playland. You'll do some B-roll, I'm sure, if you don't have some on file. And when you do, look around for yourself and see the need of what's been neglected over a period of time. Other questions? Anybody else wish to ask any other questions? We're happy to do any one-on-one interviews if you'd like. And if not, I'll thank you for your time. Thank you all very much.